Hello and welcome to another episode of Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. Today in the studio with me, I'm absolutely excited to have Jacques Blagburn. Jacques is co-founder of Fether Labs, a deep tech startup that builds wrist-worn sensors that read tendon displacement and mechanical pressure and translate hand and finger motion into digital output. He co-founded Fether Labs as a spin-out from Imperial College London. Fether ships a developer kit, a wristband, plus a web platform and APIs, and maintains proprietary datasets aimed at wearable manufacturers, robotics teams, industrial operators, smart home firms, and clinicians. In today's episode, we talk about how to get high-quality data from the wrist.
What we're proposing is a new sensor that has really high-quality signals at the wrist that was purposely designed for the wrist.
What even is mechanotendography?
If you're able to map individually how each tendon moves, you can reconstruct how the fingers move.
Why there is a risk focusing on the core technology instead of the application.
Startups live off feedback, so you need to get into the hands of people as quickly as possible.
Building technology for 1 billion users.
Probably not going to sell 1 billion bands, but what you can do is work with a multitude of companies who sell to 1 billion customers.
Why full hand kinematics is Fether Labs' raison d'etre.
Full hand kinematics, knowing each node of each finger where it is.
How accountability is the missing part of taking on grant funding.
At some point, you got to get serious about commercialization, and accountability is the missing part to grants.
And why in research you create value by taking the hard path, whilst commercially it's often about finding the path of least resistance.
In research, you create value by taking the hard path, solving the hard problems, whereas in business it's about creating the path of least resistance.
Let's get straight into it. Hi guys, whilst I've got you for a second, I just thought I'd reintroduce myself. My name's Aarish. I am the host of Nothing Ventured, the podcast where I talk to the people behind the stories that make the venture ecosystem go around. I'm also the founder of Emerge One, a consultancy that provides fractional CFO support to venture-backed tech startups from seed to Series B and beyond. If you enjoy the podcast, I would really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe wherever it is that you listen. And if you're ever up for a bit of a conversation, do reach out on LinkedIn or X. I'm always up for a natter. Right, let's get straight back into it. Jack, welcome to the studio. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's a bit cooler in London at the moment, so hopefully the commute down here wasn't as stressful as it might have been over the last few days.
That was fine. You get used to it, you know? Acclimatization.
I'm not entirely sure about that. Yesterday I had the entire block went into a blackout because
right.
The main lines went down. But look, I think one thing that the last couple of weeks has taught me is air conditioning is really important. And
it's the main reason I go to work nowadays. You know?
Just in the aircon. Cool. I can well imagine. Well, the studio is thankfully not too bad as well. Look, we're gonna get straight into it because we've got a huge amount to talk about across a number of kind of different topic areas, right? But one thing is this whole kind of question of why camera-based gesture control and EMG have hit a ceiling to some extent, and what mechanotendography unlocks for real-world environments. And you're probably going to have to explain what mechanotendography is
sure.
to start with. But when do you choose tendon sensing over cameras or EMG for an OEM product? And what are the trade-offs in calibration, integration effort, or lost visual context that you're prepared to accept to gain force and micro gesture fidelity?
Okay, so camera-based tracking is great when you can see the hands.
Okay.
And the biggest culprit is occlusion. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, if I look at my hand here and I just twist it, I can only see my thumb and my index. And for applications within film and production, robotics training, even VR and AR, that is a one hell of a crutch.
You're losing 90% of potential.
Exactly,
data,
yeah. And especially in use cases where you need really high fidelity data. Mm-hmm. Now, EMG, electromyography, is a relatively old technology. It was actually a very unsexy technology in the neuroscience space. But nowadays it's a lot more popular. And it uses 2 electrodes and calculates the difference in impedance across a muscle. Basically how, when you tense a muscle, there is a higher level of conductance across the muscle, and those two electrodes pick up. And so basically, it's a good way to know if a muscle's contracting or not.
Yeah.
And with that information, you can recreate. If I was to put it here on the forearm, you're able to recognize gestures and recognize, hand position to a certain extent. It's really used in prosthetics.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with electromyography, it works great when there's muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that in locations like the wrist, there's very little muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way other companies deal with that is with large-scale data collection and machine learning models, as well as pairing it with other sensors like accelerometers and IMUs. And what they do is they collect incredible amounts of data. We're talking about from hundreds of thousands of users. There's only a certain amount of companies in the world that can afford to do that. And they train certain gestures to 5 years in advance. And once it works, that's their moat. It takes 5 years to do that.
Data, yeah, sure.
It's the data, right?
Yeah. As you and I were just talking about, as I've mentioned on this podcast probably 100 times over the last few months, the new or enduring moats seem to be distribution, hardware, and proprietary data. Yeah.
So there's a lot of companies out there, a lot of consumer electronics companies who want to build a wristband to control devices using EMG, but they can't afford it. For companies who can afford it, it's fantastic because they've already collected the data, it's already commoditized, they can recycle it for their development internally, whatever. And what we're proposing is a new sensor that has really high quality signals at the wrist that was purposely designed for the wrist so that you can circumvent the need for large scale machine learning. And what that means is that you can go, if you are a consumer electronics company, you can go to market way faster than if you were to use other sensor technologies to go compete with the EMG folks.
Faster and cheaper, presumably?
Well, the R&D costs are way cheaper for sure.
What do you lose out? Like, is there a trade-off in that speed and potentially cost with the I guess the accuracy or the level of data that you're able to collect?
So our USP is really high quality data.
Right.
That's what we pride ourselves on. In terms of trade-offs, if you're entering the consumer market, you need to have as little calibration as possible.
Yeah. So user by user, you don't want to have to recalibrate every time a user is.
Well, there's a gray area where it's either you have absolutely no calibration at all.
Yeah, so anyone will use it in the same way.
Yeah. Or there is an initial calibration, very much like Face ID, or even we were talking about the Whoop and the Ouras. The first 2 weeks you don't get any data.
Yeah.
As
it
long
needs
as
a baseline to measure against.
As long as it's the first time. If it's every time, it's unusable, unless it's for very specific industrial use cases where they need super high quality, super personalized
precision
data.
Manufacturing.
Or stuff like that. Yeah. So that's kind of the one thing that, that's something to know. But what we're doing internally is that we're preparing a basic gesture set already. Another thing I also like to touch upon about the problem with machine learning and large data sets is that every time you change the hardware, it makes it really difficult to recycle that data. Even if I was to replace these electrodes or these sensors around the band differently, as imagine you're a consumer electronics company, you want to release a new product 2, product 3, that data is not as clean as it used to be. Yeah. And so that's a big challenge as well.
You lose fidelity because moving the sensors essentially, it moves the point, it changes. Yeah, exactly. It
so you're creating another layer of work that basically you need to translate the previous data set into new, circumstances. And what we provide is a lot more flexible and workable and easier to develop on technology.
Yeah. So this term mechanotendography. That presumably, like breaking it down, is mechanical mapping of tendons. Is that correct?
Yes. So at the wrist, you have a very sophisticated network of tendons that go on the top of the wrist and on the bottom, and they're antagonistic. So if I go like this, it's pulling this way and it's releasing on this side and vice versa. So it's like a pulley system. And if you're able to map individually how each tendon moves, you can reconstruct how the fingers move. It's a technology that has a lot more higher spatial resolution. So you're able to pick up a lot clearer what's going on in different parts of the wrist, whereas other technologies, if you put for instance, if you put EMG here and you put it here, the signal is going to be really similar.
Okay. So think of it as cleaner.
Think of it as going from HD to 4K.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And
so increase in fidelity.
Yeah.
And so, excuse my naivety here, right? Like, is this another case of, whether EMG or whether camera-based or visual kind of gesture control, were those just the norms and they were good enough that people just continued to use them, and therefore no one really thought about trying to map these gestures and these motions in a different way? Or was it that the technology wasn't good enough, or the ability to capture the data was not yet kind of at the levels it needed? I mean, like, what was a moment that made this technology more usable?
I understand.
I guess.
So for electromyography, because it's from the neuroscience space, it's only neuroscientists were developing on it.
Right. For their use cases.
And neuroscientists love electrodes. They'll stick it in your scalp, behind your ears, on your face. That's what they know.
Yeah.
Right. And they're obsessed with neural signals.
Yeah.
And when it came to our development, there was no sensor on the market, mechanical pressure sensors, or that could be that was tuned well enough to measure how your tendons are moving.
Yeah.
And so there was effectively a massive sensor design challenge to address. And the challenge is that if you were to put it on a band and you put a mechanical sensor, actually the best analogy is like a key on a keyboard. When you press it, it bottoms out. The problem is that when you put it on a wristband and you tighten it, the key,
there's some pressure.
The key bottoms out. So how do you get a sensor that once it's close to bottoming out, it still has that really high fidelity signal? And so that's the real crux of the challenge that we were solving. And so the outcome of that was making a completely new type of sensor. And so basically, the people working in this space were not considering mechanical sensors because that's not their expertise.
Sure.
They are heavily reliant on electrodes and general really sophisticated digital signal processing techniques. Whereas we are from the ultrasound space, which we have a completely different way of thinking, and we have a lot of experience with mechanical forces, pressure, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so we were able to make a new type of sensor to basically replace or work with EMG.
Yeah. So essentially you pivoted out of the ultrasound space, but just repurposed the technology.
I think looking back at what happened with us, it was really working from first principles. You put your hand here and you feel things move. Let's try and monitor this.
Yeah. How do we capture that?
Rather than using neural signals or EMG, which is, for muscle where there's no muscle.
Which could be fuzzy data, right?
Yeah, which is super fuzzy. But, there are companies who have been successful with that, but at what cost?
Yeah. It's super, super interesting. And I mean, we were just talking about this outside earlier. The obvious, there are just multiple applications, right? Like
it's actually a blessing and a curse.
Yeah. Where do you focus? But you could focus on everything.
Because you can do anything with this technology. Like if you think about the touchscreen, all the different applications of the touchscreen, now think of that in a 3D space.
Yeah.
It's actually quite overwhelming in the beginning. And a lot of our early journey was actually trying to find and just focus on one thing.
Yeah.
Which in our case was controlling a device using hand gestures. It turns out to be AR glasses is the main use case at the moment.
Well, the obvious one that comes to my mind from pop fiction is Tom Cruise. What's the film? It's not Mission Impossible. it's the one where where he's got the screens up in front of him, he's just gesturing and kind of moving around. There's obviously there's a bunch of films with a similar sort
I know which film you're talking about, because everyone talks about it. It's just off. I can't tell you off the top.
It's not Mission Impossible. Anyway, we'll have to look that up and come back to it. But yeah, like, I mean, and there have been countless kind of ads and futuristic kind of programs where you have people walking down the street and kind of gesturing in front of them.
Yeah.
And you could imagine, I mean, not to get too kind of future utopian about this, but you could imagine, your phone actually just remains in your pocket and is no longer the main device by which you interact on the web. It could be via whether it's smart glasses with your technology that allows you to gesture, or even if you're able to kind of mirror onto a screen or whatever and then use your hands to gesture. But yeah, I mean, I think as we were talking outside, whether it's robotics, whether it's gaming, whether it's drone control, as James wanted to investigate further. Like,
he's not the first one, don't worry.
Okay, he's fine. But there are clearly lots of opportunities. So actually, let's talk about this kind of problem, and it is really a hard problem, of building a developer platform around a novel sensor. And you touched on this a little bit, and getting it to work out of the box for OEMs, right? So how do you allocate engineering time between improving the sensor and building developer tooling? And what are the kind of failure modes, miscalibrations, brittle SDKs, or excessive data set needs that you're willing to tolerate to ship sooner? Like, what is a balance for you?
Yeah. So the first thing, startups like live off feedback.
Yeah.
So you need to get into hands of people as quickly as possible. The risk is that you focus too much on the core technology and not on the application, because the application is where the value is made. So in terms of building software development kits, APIs and stuff like that, I think it's as important as making the best sensor on the planet.
Got it.
But once you got that, then it's an iterative cycle, because what you tend to find is that people will complain about certain performance metrics, which usually tend to go back to the core technology.
Yeah. And
so with that, it's basically you're building a feedback pipeline for your startup.
Yeah.
Once you've got the software development kit. And then you build a community around that and stuff like that. Now, when it comes to working with OEMs and licensing the technology, it is, a chicken and the egg. You need to show that your technology works.
Without overbaking
it, but also prove that there are the applications out there that are big enough for them to invest their time in integrating it into their products. So the solution for that is having a developer kit, which we call the Fether Band, and we distribute it to very specific people who have a very specific use case. Usually they're industry or consumer electronics companies, for them to do evaluation and develop proof of concepts. Also, what that device is also a reference design for them, because
how do we take this and build the new product?
How do you actually physically integrate the electronics? How would I actually build the electronics around this thing? They just worry about manufacturing and distribution. And so really, when you look at companies, I like to talk about companies like Dolby, because Dolby obviously super famous for their speakers. Nowadays they make a lot of their money from licensing their software off that. But, their reference designs are effectively those speakers, but also, their reputation, their branding, and, the R&D on all that feedback they got from
every
that.
Every single film has, Dolby surround sound kind of on it or whatever.
Yeah. And so, so that's how that world works. Coming back to why I originally said, building a technology for 1 billion users, like the touchscreen, you're probably not going to sell 1 billion bands.
Sure.
But what you can do is work with a multitude of companies who sell to 1 billion customers.
Yeah.
And so it really, when it comes back to, these different business models, it really is, what is your mission? And for us, it's clearly, what is going to be the next thing after the keyboard and the mouse and the touchscreen.
You almost want to become a commodity within the space, right? But essentially the sole source of supply, right?
It feels like, you first build a band, which is the full stack. And then over time, you start removing layers from that. and you become more invisible and less and more in the shadows. And that's very common.
Yeah.
Very, very common.
It's almost a case of, Fether Labs itself will never be a household name, but it'll be in every household.
That's the goal.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's super interesting. And I think, your whole point, that trope around fast feedback loops, right? And, the lean startup methodology, obviously, 10, 15 years ago was very much of the moment, right? And how startups thought about themselves as almost scientific experiments, right? With software, that's one thing. With hardware, that iterative loop could be A, far more costly, but B, far harder to kind of maintain speed with, right? Because with every iteration, let's say you've got it in the hands of 100 OEMs all using it, and they're giving not necessarily conflicting, but different types of feedback around what is a priority, what isn't for them. How do you make the decisions then about, okay, well, we have either budget or engineering skill set or whatever to be able to build out, these 3 or 5 versus those 10 or 12 other responses you got back? Like, how do you decide on what is the most important feedback to take on board and then develop on? Because with software, you could literally just try it all, right?
Yeah. Of course. So it goes back to being really clear of what is the final chapter of Fether Labs.
Mm-hmm.
And
so what brings you closer to that?
Yes. What is your mission? And on commercial side, but also the technical side, what is kind of the North Star in terms of what we build? For us, it's full hand kinematics, which is knowing each node of each finger where it is, right? And so everything you do needs to be aligned with your why, effectively. When it comes to startups, the most important skill set you need is actually resource allocation and risk management.
Yep.
So every piece of feedback
I'm glad you said that, not me, but
every piece of feedback you get, you need to have effectively need to do a risk mitigation and look at is there a clear ROI on what you do? Because money can go quick, very fast in hardware, and so those are like the key things that really those are the levers with which we make decisions.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, as as a CFO, I'm, as I say, very glad you kind of raised it. That whole kind of resource allocation thing is so critical in startups. I don't think people understand that as much, right? You have multiple constraints, right? And decision-making under constraint is one of the hardest things. It's hard because intellectually you've got to figure out what does, have the most return. But actually, to an extent, it makes it easier because out of this, a field of 100 options, you can only narrow that you have to pick 2 or 3, right? So then you can't be wasteful, right? Because you have limited capital, limited people, limited opportunity, etc., right? And limited time, right? Because obviously, especially when you're building a startup, you need to be moving quick enough that no one's going to catch you up from behind, and that you also remain kind of part of the zeitgeist. And so just talk me through, because you've raised recently,
last year,
some seed capital, presumably, right? Because you said it yourself, you were a researcher, you were doing purely kind of academic research, I guess, at the time. How was that transition into like suddenly having a bunch of capital that you had to manage? Because
I think the biggest difference, and I've been asked this a few times, but the biggest difference is that in research, you create value by taking the hard path, solving the hard problems, whereas in business, it's about creating the path of least resistance. It's basically about alignment.
Yeah.
It's a completely different mentality. And so I see it, with the more technical folks at Fether Labs, it's about trying to solve the hard way and but in business, sometimes you need to take a step back and actually, what do our customers want, and what is the fastest way we can deliver value?
Yeah.
Back to alignment is like, how can we monetize this in a way that makes the taking on our technology as easy as possible?
Yeah.
Right, that is like a completely different way of thinking. Yeah, it's quite a culture shock in a way for a lot of researchers. But I wasn't in research for too long, so I was still had a bit of plasticity.
I've spoken to many researchers over recent years, and it is quite a shock. I think that transition from research into commercial, because yes, exactly to your point, right? Like, and often what happens is I think researchers that spin out, they want to remain researchers, right? They live for the science of what they've built or discovered or what they are building. And actually the commercial path potentially comes second. But especially if you have taken external capital, you need to have that commercial outcome very firmly, not at the back of your mind, but like mid to forefront, right? Yes, the technology and the science is super interesting, but without the commercial application, you neither have a business or a product that even from an academic perspective, can get out into the world and potentially, provide some of the benefit that you would hope it would, right? So yeah, I mean, what would you tell kind of aspiring academics at the moment that may have something that could have commercial value? How should they think about like just moving forward?
I think you just need to get your feet wet, because the truth is, a lot of these kind of academic, a lot of academic research, the final commercial use case is completely different to what it used to be, what it originally was.
And it's unknown, right, often.
Yeah. And just building those relationships and understanding different markets, how they operate, is the first part. And then when it comes to developing the technology, the barrier can be a lot lower than people think. When you're in academic research, I was at Imperial, so it was quite, it was very tough. And it's like people trying to really, really push the needle. And, it has a real culture of like being really pushy in a good way. Is like, you don't need to make it perfect.
Perfect, yeah.
Right. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be number one in the world.
Which is the whole startup kind of philosophy, right? Ship fast. Doesn't matter if it's broken.
And I think that takes a bit of time to get used to. I think when I look back when we started, to be quite honest, it's like the goal is full hand kinematics, but the number of people who come to us and say, hey, can you just have a click and then like a cursor? It's like, yeah, and you could build a whole business around that.
Yeah, sure.
And obviously, over time, we would probably want to add more features and stuff like that.
But you can start there.
Yeah, you can start there. And so the barrier to entry is sometimes a lot lower than people think.
I really do agree. I mean, like, I think there is, in academia, the whole point is being as polished and as thorough as possible, right? Like, you when you're a researcher, you're often writing papers, and those papers are peer reviewed, etc. So you need to dot I's, cross T's all the way through. Whereas commercially, often good enough is good enough, right?
Yeah, and actually an extension to that, and more on the timeline side, is like, academia is so far ahead. Actually, that's a very broad statement, but academia tends to be a little, a fair few years ahead to industry. Companies usually die because they're too early.
Sure.
So, being really aware of that like, actually, you don't need to be super, super ahead, because the market might not be ready for your stuff.
Yeah.
Especially in human machine interfacing.
Yeah, sure.
I think that's something also to, to have in mind. But in general, business and academia is about intellectual stimulation and the taking the long road, looking things from the most fundamental level, whereas business is a human game. And so it's a completely different
it's a trust game.
Yes.
You've got to find people that will, or companies or people that will trust you and the technology that you're building enough to warrant them taking the time, interest, and spending the money.
That's our whole game. In our case, it is really investing in meeting people well ahead of they might need it, but just like being there and building, understanding, their problems and then, but one day when the market's ready for,
so you're seeding the ground, essentially, building the foundation.
Exactly, and it's not about a hard sell. It's actually, it's a human game.
Well, it has to be with novel technology, especially, right? Because, it's very easy to sell something let's take the obvious, the Uber and the Airbnb cases, right? These were not businesses built around something that people even understood that they needed, right? Like they were built initially as essentially a cab booking service, right? And then, Airbnb is, rent out your room to someone, capturing that underutilized real estate. But they turned into very much, platforms that created an entire new category, right? In both instances. And I think with most novel technologies, you've got to find the angle that people can understand enough of that they will take the bet, the risk, the punt, whatever you want to call it, on trying the technology, versus if you come out and you're like, we have full hand kinematics, and it's the most incredibly sophisticated sensor on the planet, may actually put people off, right? Because it may be like, well, this is over-engineered for our requirements.
But also, that's probably like the best scenario. Realistically, you need to be aware of like what are the levers with which people make decisions. Consumer electronics is all about cost. In our cases, what's the minimum number of sensors we need to put it into our device? While still having, the best performance as possible. Like you need to engage and build these relationships with people to really understand how they think. And in deep tech, I think, it's super important. And in academia, that's something that a lot of universities are realizing that's a problem. And they have now, I know Imperial, they have like an industry panel that's really like, in multiple departments where they bring in people from industry, from large corporate companies to explain to them like, this is how we think, this is how, this is what it takes to get into products that people take for granted every day. That's a really deep subject, though. That we can go quite deep.
I mean, we absolutely. Well, let's kind of stay slightly on a similar topic, which is around this entire renaissance of deep tech at the moment, especially as a spin out, right? How do you think about prioritizing kind of grant-funded R&D and patent accumulation to preserve that optionality? This is a little bit what we were talking about just now as well. Or do you push early with those commercial pilots with OEMs to prove product market fit? And certainly sounds like that's the path that you chose. And are there sacrifices that you therefore have to make in terms of runway or the people that you hire or the type of investors you take on board when you select one path over the other?
Grants are amazing. We won a bunch of grants, so I'm not going to start.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, they have they're an incredibly important part of the capital stack. Yeah,
but also we've taken on private investment, and I think the difference is that you're not held accountable by grants. And I think a lot of people who win grants push away a lot of the fundamental questions that they need to answer within their business,
because the capital doesn't need to be answered. Exactly, it doesn't need to be returned essentially.
Exactly, so, and I think there's a lot of spin outs who grant hop. I think it's healthy to a certain extent, to just take private investment, because it makes you focus on what really matters and what really pushes the business forward. But
it's also a form of validation as well.
Yeah, right? But to a certain extent, but also in the negative, as in like, if you don't answer these questions in time, well, that means there probably wasn't an answer. If you would have taken a grant, you would have just kicked the can down the
and potentially not wasted time, but you may spend 2 years doing R&D on something that's never going to have application either commercial or elsewhere. Whereas if you're forced down the path of okay, well, I've taken private investment, I need to now start thinking about what the actual use case is. It actually, again, it provides focus as a lot of people I think that take funding realize.
The caveat to that is timelines again.
Yeah, of course.
So your technology that's really early but has a massive potential, too early for investment, obviously grants make sense. That was not my case. When we started the technology, I remember winning our first grant and it was amazing. It wasn't that big, but it was like, it felt like winning the lottery.
Had you already incorporated at this point?
No.
Okay, fine.
No, it was an academic grant, but we won the first. It was like, wow, like, let's go build it. Let's go build this thing. And it's only take 3.5 years for the market to actually start bubbling up to us. And I mean, that's mostly the case for spin out companies, in academia. And again, that timeline between when the market's ready from academia. But that's, I think, where grants make the most sense. But at some point, you got to get serious about commercialization, and accountability is the missing part of grants.
I think that's incredibly accurate. And of course, we see lots of businesses that we work with, of course, who take both, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with being a commercially focused business that has taken private investment, but that also has clear research and R&D elements to what they're doing, especially within hardware, I would say. And therefore, rounding off private capital with a grant is not a bad thing to do, because it does give you the extra room, space, time, and runway to get into some of those deeper questions, right? So I absolutely don't think there's a wrong or right. I do agree, if you're only taking grants, then potentially you run the risk of kicking the can. But I think private capital kind of incentivizes you differently.
But going back to your question, you mentioned what kind of investors you need. I think, I just came back from San Francisco, and, the big thing I remember is robotics. And robotics is 10 years away.
Yeah.
But the amount of capital going into it, there's clearly a profile investor who sees that, the timelines, is still willing to invest in it. So, there is an ecosystem out there that can support this kind of research.
Yeah.
But again, I think the advantage of having, a long-term investor is that you're going to get the capital, but also he is forcing you to answer those critical commercial questions, which in deep tech, so a lot of people run away from.
Yeah. I've had lots of conversations with deep tech investors recently, and one of them, and I won't mention the fund or who he is, but one of the things he said to me was, it's a really exciting time to be a deep tech investor, and he is a deep tech investor, but one of the things that he said was that the fund hasn't. It's a generalist investor.
Yeah.
He specifically invests in deep tech, but whilst it's seen lots of deep tech deals, it hasn't actually invested in one this year, because what is becoming harder to really get to the bottom of is how much of this, or which of these technologies is going to be truly commercializable, right? Over the long term, and will have that massive outcome, which certainly all venture kind of investors looking at. And so actually, just on that whole point of commercialization, right? And I've talked about this in terms of kind of, you mentioned it earlier, looking at companies like Arm and Dolby, and going down that licensing route. But if you commit to a licensing first route for OEMs, there will be revenue streams or elements of product control, or even go-to-market options that you have to forego, right? Whereas if you owned your distribution, that would give you different options, right? So what is the kind of patent exposure or partner capture risk that you're prepared to accept, right? Because I can imagine, I don't know, pick a name out of anywhere, but let's say one of the game console companies says, yeah, we want to license this, but we want exclusivity, right? That then
exclusivity is a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, sure.
And the truth is, with exclusivity, usually the next question is, how much would you buy the company?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, but when it comes to the licensing game, sales cycles for licensing is extremely long, but you got to start at some point. You might as well start now or yesterday to work on building those relationships towards a licensing deal. But that's why still having a hardware product like a developer kit makes a lot of sense,
right?
Because if ever there is once you distribute those devices and you find that there is a killer use case, you want to know first.
Yeah, sure.
And because you have built that developer kit and you have built your own supply chain, you could always flip the switch.
Yeah. You could turn around and say, well, actually, that looks super interesting. We're going to go down that route.
Yeah. But also, you would have already engaged with the customers. The other part of your question was, what are you willing to, like how much control, basically?
What are the trade-offs?
Yeah. A lot of these licensing companies have forward engineers.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, a licensing deal will be structured with a upfront cost and a royalty payment. The upfront cost basically pays off the internal costs of having a forward engineers helping that company integrate it into their products.
Essentially, the R&D and the integration. Yeah.
So that is covered in the deals. Now, what's interesting is that the larger the company, the less they want you involved. The more they just want access to the patents. The smaller the company, the more of a turnkey solution they want. They want a band that they can white label and slap their logo on or something like that. Or even some of them just like, actually, we just want to integrate. You can have your band, we'll have your band, but we just want to have it sold as a package with our other product, And so basically, you need to really understand where in a stack, where you can make, what are your business, what are your business layers, right? So obviously there's the patents, there's obviously the sensors on their own, there's obviously the sensors and the band, and then there's the sensors, the band, and the data,
right?
In our case. And so obviously different prices for different layers. But yeah, so I hope that answered your...
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, like it in a almost perverse way, you're actually maintaining optionality by going down the licensing route rather than picking one route yourself, right?
It's not like licensing is to a certain extent should be the end goal for a lot of deep tech technologies, because you want cross-pollination and you can't cover all the use cases. I mean, it happens to me all the time. People think of things like, yeah, we could do that, but we just don't have the bandwidth. Or like that's not our primary market. I'm sure it's a big market, but it's not the biggest one, which we would focus on.
Mean, I like, here's one randomly, just so you can play with it in your head over the next few days. I was literally just thinking, right? So I used to play the flute, the piano.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure there's a use case there that could train. You could train on professional pianists, etc. But when then teaching students of these instruments, understanding, what sort of pressure they want to be putting on, how they should be thinking about their finger movements, etc., etc. That would be like a ridiculous thing to go out and build.
This is where we would want to. We wouldn't want to block these things.
Yeah.
We would want to help people build those use cases. And it only benefits us. The more use cases there are, the more people using the band, the more we're closer to our mission.
I mean, I'm a very small investor in a health tech business. It's sort of sports tech, right? It's a mirror system with weights, and the sensors on the mirror capture your kind of movements, etc. But like, I could imagine for them, this could be incredibly interesting, at some point, because you could measure grip strength and obviously the kind of weight load and bearing and all of this sort of stuff, right?
There's so many.
It's just infinite. It's
infinite.
That's really annoying.
But I mean, you're wearing
beautiful,
the root,
but really annoying.
You're wearing the root, right? Right. At some point, it's got to tell you, how much weight you got in your hand. It
doesn't.
It doesn't yet. But the point is
if you're listening,
but there might be some people out there who want to have those use cases, who want to build on top of our technology, and we want to encourage people to do that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's absolutely the right way to approach it. Jack, this has been a really phenomenal conversation, and as you say, I think we could probably talk for hours about the whole thing. And I think that's one of the beauties of deep tech is, when you land on a piece of technology that is truly novel, right? The opportunities become so endless and vast, right? That as we just said, right, it's either overwhelming or it's incredibly useful, because you can just see what works, right, across a huge number of domains. You're not having to pick one route that then, maybe, a binary works, doesn't work kind of strategy. And I mean, you guys are relatively early, right, in the journey, but it sounds like you've already kind of moved forward quite significantly in terms of getting it into the hands of potential, partners. And yeah, I mean, I can't wait to see what you guys do next, because even if I don't hear the name Fether Labs, when that next thing comes on the market that's telling me how my tendons are working, I will know that you guys are behind it. I want to finish off with a couple of questions we ask all of our guests.
Yeah.
So, Jack, what is one thing that you have a contrarian conviction about from any area of life, whether that's work, politics, socially, or at home?
I don't think it's contrarian.
It's funny how many people caveat their answer to this question with that.
Well, the thing is that there's probably some contrarian things I think, but I just don't realize it because I think it's normal, right? But I think the most important skill set for anyone is how coachable you are.
Yeah.
It's probably the most...
Growth mindset.
It is growth mindset makes it sound not contrarian at all.
Yeah, sure.
But that coachability and willing to take on feedback is the most important thing. Once you stop taking on feedback, you stop growing. You stop and you plateau.
Being the dumbest person in the room is actually quite powerful.
Yes. But that didn't sound contrarian at all. So
I would say it's contrarian to the extent that I think a lot of people think that they are coachable, but probably aren't.
Yeah.
Because most people, we saw this with a founder we were working with several years ago. And to give you the example, he'd been incredibly successful, had raised hundreds of millions, but then the company went through some issues and ended up essentially being recapitalized and not quite starting again, but starting again. This founder surrounded himself with really smart people, including like one of our CFOs. He would listen to them in the room, but only for the sake of listening to them, to kind of show that he had listened, but then would just make his own decisions irrespective, right? And I think, I think especially for founders, it's this kind of double-edged sword. You want founders to be coachable, but you also want them to be decisive, right? So not that they should just be listening to the last, the last piece of advice that someone in potential position of authority has given them, but coachable enough that they know that they should take on that feedback, digest it, understand it, and make their own decision about how valuable or not valuable, how applicable it is. So I do think I think it is probably more contrarian than you think, because terms like growth mindset get bandied about a lot, especially for younger people, I would say. But I know lots of people. I know people who say they don't read books anymore because I don't have time for that. And I'm like, well, okay, but then how do you grow? Well, I know enough already, and I find that actually incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and just being like seeking discomfort.
Yeah.
When I started this, I would have. I remember doing my first pitch in front of a crowd of investors, and it was like, that was so discomforting, obviously. Very
and now
nervy.
You're on a podcast. Yeah.
And now, and now I actually enjoy it. But then there's new stuff to be uncomfortable with, And
well, imagine when you do your first licensing deal with a massive, conglomerate, like presumably 3 years ago, that wasn't, wasn't something you'd have done.
Right? Yeah. And I think at some point you just got to realize that even Elon Musk, right, or like super successful people, they don't have it all figured out either. They're all kind of, they all have the same worries and doubts about themselves, but they've just are in an environment where, they just get on with it. Kind of like, it's like they're in an environment where they've grown so fast where, they're in the position of whatever, whether it's Elon Musk or another CEO or whatever, is they're always in front of things that are new. And so they're just kind of like, not winging it, but like they are comfortable not knowing the answer.
Yeah.
But they've got enough experience to have developed a thought process or a framework of thinking that allows them to react well.
the comedian Jimmy Carr invites the audience to ask him questions, right? And, if you go on Instagram and search up Jimmy Carr's kind of clips, they're actually, very philosophical, I think, in nature. And someone asked him, what is something, what is something that rich people understand that other people don't? And Jimmy Carr, he said something actually really profound, which was, the reality is, right, that everyone has problems. If you are rich, you just have a different set of problems. So it's your approach to how you solve those problems that is important, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, existentially, those problems might be quite different, right? But it's true. There was, and again, I won't mention the name, but, a well-known sort of family business principal who recently lost one of his children, right? At a young age, sort of in their 20s or whatever, whilst they were on holiday. From the outside looking in, someone might say, well, that guy is like incredibly, immensely wealthy. He's got no problems in the world. But of course, he's just had like one of the saddest things that can happen, right? So human beings are human beings, irrespective. And I think to your point around discomfort and how you handle those sort of situations, one of my biggest fears is that our kids are not uncomfortable anymore. And because they're not uncomfortable, they are less well equipped to deal with the world. And maybe that's, from my perspective, because I come from a place of some privilege. And I'm sure there are many, many people out there that, whose kids are very uncomfortable on a very regular basis, right? But I think, broadly speaking, access to information, et cetera, we're seeing declines in critical thinking, all of these sort of things, is because your brain and indeed you as a person grow through those acts of discomfort, right? You fall down, you learn not to fall down again. You touch something hot, you learn not to touch that thing again. And the pain of learning something, and the process you go through in terms of consolidating and, first ingesting, then consolidating, etc. Like, these are painful, almost physically painful things that you go through as a child. And now with the advent of AI and LLMs, you can just short circuit that entirely, and therefore you're not learning. You're just literally repeating something that you've just read. So no, I think that point about discomfort, and anyone, whether they're rich or not rich, I think that anyone who has just had experience, right, in life, brings the sum totality of that experience and all of the failures and positives or whatever that they've had in their life to the problem at hand, right? And I think that's one of the concerns I have is, in the age of AI, fewer and fewer people are going to have gone through that feedback loop of failure and, learning and understanding and building from there. And therefore they're going to really struggle when those failures first happen. Finally, so that we can get to know the real you, although I think we've learned a lot about you already today, what is something that moves you the most emotionally?
The thing is, my work is like my life.
I honestly, yeah. I was going to say, right? Like,
I'm not a particularly emotional person.
No, but I was going to say, right? Like, when you were talking about the ultrasound technology and then building Fether Labs, like, what that sounded like to me was, it's that this is my life's work.
Oh yeah. I'm not building this for 10 years. Like, I would happily end my career in, decades and be like, I did wristbands.
Yeah.
I feel like I've found my life's work already. I'm very, very fortunate. But what would move me when I look at entrepreneurship, it's a real privilege. I am so lucky to have my girlfriend and also my family be really supportive of what I've gone through, because it wasn't easy.
Sure.
There was some moments we had no cash, nothing. We just, we were making it work, and it was like, and I think that's the thing I'm most grateful for in my life, is that I've had the support network that has allowed me to pursue Fether Labs. The late nights, the weeks of continuously finishing work past midnight and then having to go back to the office at super early, like stupid hours of work. I work extremely hard because they supported me, and so the bare minimum I could do is make this work. You know what I mean? So I think that's actually the thing that moves me the most, is when I think about how much they support. My mum, I'm very lucky actually. My mum had businesses herself, so she really understands what I went through, and my dad also really believes in what I've built. But my girlfriend, like, she sees the slog every day. You know, we've been together for more than 6 years, you know, and it's like she was there from the beginning. And you know, I think I'm so grateful. And I think that moves me the most when I look back and think about I wouldn't have been able to do this without their support.
I think that's beautiful. I think a lot of founders out there will both resonate with what you just said, and there'll be a lot of founders that will feel really, really sad that they don't have that in their lives, because it is definitely one of the hardest things.
You know, as hard as it can be, in the hardest times, that's when you should say, entrepreneurship, the fact that I am pursuing what I want to do with the people I want to work with is a privilege.
It is, yeah.
It's a real privilege. And because as much as entrepreneurship is romanticized, it is a slog sometimes, especially the early days. And even
I think
later.
Everyone can attest to that who's ever tried to build a business. I mean, look, I think what you said is beautiful. It's wonderful. And I don't think people talk about it enough, or maybe they talk about it in a very not dismissive, but you know, they kind of give it cursory sort of time. I had a guest on recently, and she co-founded the business with her husband, and she, you know, we talked about this whole thing about husband and wife co-founders and you know, whether it works, it doesn't work, or whatever. And you know, you if you listen to her, you would get the impression that there's no one else she would rather do this with, right? For lots of reasons. But having someone that understands, that sees you, but is able to be there for you emotionally as well, I think is incredibly important, right? I've been building my own businesses for the last, whatever, decade or so. Without my wife beside me, I don't think I would have been able to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, the reality is there are days when I get home and I just want to, you know, collapse, right? And, you know, she's there to yell at me, or has made me a meal, or, you know, has some random thing that she wants me to help her with, or whatever, right? But, you know, she will see when the day has been good or the day has been bad, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes just having someone there that acknowledges that it's been good or bad or rough or not or whatever is the simplest thing in the world, but it's the most meaningful.
Imagine doing it alone.
Yeah, I can't.
Impossible.
Yeah.
Impossible.
And I think
alone with your thoughts, like, you know, you come back home at like 11 p.m. You have to make your food, and you're just thinking there like, oh shit, like if you don't have, like, it's just, if you don't have at least someone to talk to, and like, you know.
And I think this is you know, this is why people often say build with a co-founder, because, you know, there is that balance, right? And you have someone that you're building with. But I actually, you know, I'm a strong believer that solo founders can go the distance as long as they have, to your point, that support system around them.
100%. I there's no way someone can build a business alone and be alone all day. Like, there's just no way.
Or they'd build it, but they'd just be really unhappy.
Yeah,
right?
Fair enough. But I'm that makes me very emotional and very, very privileged. It makes me feel really privileged of not only what I'm doing, but also who I'm doing it with.
Amazing. Look, I think you're your parents and your girlfriend will be very happy to hear that. Jack, this has been a really phenomenal conversation. For our listeners, where can they find you online? Are you on LinkedIn? Are you on X? Where's the best place to find you
I'm on LinkedIn. I am meant to open an X account, which I have to at some point.
No one in the UK really.
I know, but I just came back from San Francisco.
Yeah, well, this is the point. Yeah.
And obviously www.fetherlabs.com.
Yeah, we will put the links in the show notes. Jack, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.